I couldn't believe the day had finally arrived. My sister-in-law's wedding was just hours away, and the excitement in the air was palpable. As I stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying the finishing touches to my makeup, I couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. The dress I had chosen for the occasion was nothing short of stunning, a deep emerald green that seemed to shimmer with every movement. It hugged my curves in all the right places, making me feel both elegant and confident. The process of getting ready had been a whirlwind. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon pampering myself, starting with a long, relaxing bubble bath infused with lavender oils. As I soaked, I let my mind wander, thinking about how far we'd all come. It seemed like just yesterday that Mark, my husband, had introduced me to his sister, Emily. We'd hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of classic literature and cheesy rom-coms. Now, here I was, preparing to watch her walk down the aisle. After my bath, I'd taken my time with my hair, opting for loose, cascading waves that framed my face softly. The hairstyle had taken longer than expected, but as I looked at the final result, I knew it had been worth every minute. It complemented the dress perfectly, adding to the overall ethereal feel I was going for. As I slipped on my heels, a pair of strappy silver sandals that added just the right amount of sparkle, I heard Mark call from downstairs. "Honey, we need to leave in 10 minutes. His voice snapped me back to reality, and I realized I'd been lost in my own little world for quite some time. "Coming," I called back, giving myself one last look in the mirror. I grabbed my clutch, a delicate silver thing that barely fit my phone and lipstick, and made my way downstairs. Mark was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, looking dashing in his tailored navy suit. His eyes widened as he saw me, a smile spreading across his face. "Wow," he breathed, "you look absolutely beautiful." His words made me blush, and I felt a flutter in my stomach. Even after years of marriage, he still had that effect on me. We made our way to the car, the warm summer evening enveloping us in its embrace. The drive to the venue was filled with excited chatter about the upcoming festivities. Mark told me about the bachelor party he'd thrown for Emily's fiancé, Tom, last weekend, a camping trip that had apparently involved more mishaps than actual camping. I laughed at his stories, feeling the last of my nerves melt away. As we pulled up to the venue, I gasped. The old Victorian mansion had been transformed into a fairytale setting. Twinkling fairy lights adorned the trees lining the driveway, creating a magical canopy overhead. The scent of roses and jasmine filled the air, emanating from the lush flower arrangements that seemed to be everywhere. We made our way inside, where we were greeted by the soft melodies of a string quartet. The foyer was bustling with guests, all dressed in their finest. I spotted familiar faces in the crowd, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends we hadn't seen in ages. It felt like a grand reunion, with laughter and excited conversations filling the air. Mark's hand found the small of my back as he guided me through the crowd, stopping every few steps to introduce me to someone new. "This is my wife, Sarah," he'd say, his voice filled with pride. Each time, I'd smile and exchange pleasantries, feeling a warm glow of belonging wash over me. As we mingled, I couldn't help but notice the admiring glances thrown my way. The emerald dress was definitely turning heads, and while a part of me felt self-conscious, another part reveled in the attention. It wasn't often that I got to dress up like this, and I was determined to enjoy every moment of it. We eventually made our way to the garden, where the ceremony was to take place. Rows of white chairs had been set up, facing an archway covered in delicate white and pink roses. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything, making the scene look like something out of a painting. As we took our seats, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Turning around, I saw Lisa, one of Emily's bridesmaids and an old friend from college. "Sarah," she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. "It's been ages. You look incredible." We chatted for a few minutes, catching up on each other's lives. Lisa had recently moved to New York to pursue her dream of becoming a Broadway actress. As she regaled me with stories of auditions and tiny apartments, I felt a pang of nostalgia for our carefree college days. Our conversation was interrupted by the soft strains of music signaling the start of the ceremony. A hush fell over the crowd as we all turned to watch the procession. First came the flower girls, adorable in their pale pink dresses, scattering rose petals along the aisle. Then came the bridesmaids, each looking radiant in deep blue gowns that complemented my emerald dress beautifully. And then, there she was. Emily appeared at the end of the aisle, arm in arm with her father. She looked breathtaking in a flowing white gown, her face glowing with happiness behind her veil. As she passed by our row, she caught my eye and gave me a small wink. I felt my heart swell with affection for my sister-in-law. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Tom and Emily had written their own vows, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house as they declared their love for each other. As they sealed their union with a kiss, the garden erupted in cheers and applause. As the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, showered in rose petals and well wishes, I felt Mark's hand squeeze mine. I turned to him, seeing my own joy reflected in his eyes. It was a perfect moment, filled with love and hope for the future. The reception that followed was a whirlwind of activity. The grand ballroom of the mansion had been decorated just as beautifully as the garden, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the festivities. The air was filled with the delicious aromas of the dinner being served, and the dance floor was already filling up with eager guests. Mark and I found our seats at a table near the front, joining a mix of family and friends. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. I was in the middle of a hilarious story about my first disastrous attempt at cooking for Mark when I felt a chill run down my spine. Glancing up, I caught sight of Helen, my mother-in-law, watching me from across the room. There was something in her expression that made me uneasy, a mix of disdain and, was that jealousy? I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. This was a night for celebration, after all. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Helen's eyes were following me. Every time I looked in her direction, she seemed to be there, her gaze burning into me. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to focus on enjoying the night, dancing with Mark and catching up with old friends. But Helen's presence lingered in the back of my mind, casting a small shadow over what should have been a perfect evening. As the night drew to a close and guests began to trickle out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The wedding had been beautiful, and I was genuinely happy for Emily and Tom. But there was also a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Little did I know, as Mark and I said our goodbyes and headed home, that this night was just the beginning. The events that would unfold in the coming days would test our family in ways we never could have imagined, and change our lives forever. The days following Emily and Tom's wedding passed in a blur of thank you notes and shared photos. I found myself reliving the magical evening through the countless snapshots that flooded our family group chat. There I was, twirling on the dance floor, my emerald dress catching the light just so. Another showed Mark and me, heads bent close in laughter during the best man's speech. Each image brought back a flood of happy memories, but there was one that gave me pause, a group shot of the entire family, with Helen standing off to the side, her eyes fixed on me with an unreadable expression. I tried to push the unease aside, chalking it up to leftover nerves from the big day. But as we settled back into our routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It started small, a missed call here, an unanswered text there. Helen, who had always been quick to organize family dinners and impromptu get-togethers, suddenly became scarce. Maybe she's just giving the newlyweds some space, Mark suggested when I brought it up one evening. We were curled up on the couch, half watching a rerun of our favorite sitcom. I nodded, wanting to believe him, but the knot in my stomach told a different story. It was a couple of weeks later when things really started to unravel. We were at a family barbecue at Mark's parents' house, the first time we'd all been together since the wedding. The backyard was alive with chatter and laughter, the smell of grilling burgers filling the air. I was helping Emily set up the salad bar when I overheard a snippet of conversation from the patio. "I just don't understand why she had to wear such an attention-grabbing dress," Helen's voice carried over, sharp and clear. It was Emily's day, for heaven's sake. I froze, the bowl of cherry tomatoes in my hands suddenly feeling very heavy. Emily must have sensed my discomfort because she squeezed my arm gently. "Don't listen to her," she whispered. "You looked gorgeous." But the damage was done. For the rest of the afternoon, I felt Helen's eyes on me, scrutinizing my every move. I tried to act normally, laughing at Tom's dad jokes and cooing over baby photos with Mark's cousins. But inside, I was a mess of confusion and hurt. As the sun began to set and guests started to leave, I found myself alone in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher. The clink of plates and the hum of the machine provided a welcome distraction from my swirling thoughts. "Need a hand?" Mark's voice made me jump. I turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, a concerned look on his face. "I'm okay," I said, forcing a smile. "Just finishing up here." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You've been quiet all afternoon. What's going on?" I hesitated, not wanting to cause trouble. But the weight of Helen's words pressed down on me, and before I knew it, everything came spilling out: the overheard conversation, the pointed looks, the growing sense of unease I'd been feeling since the wedding. Mark listened in silence, his arms tightening around me as I spoke. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I had no idea Mom was acting this way." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, turning in his arms to face him. I don't know what I've done to upset her." "You haven't done anything," Mark said firmly. "This is her issue, not yours. I'll talk to her, okay?" I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Part of me wanted to just let it go, to pretend everything was fine. But another part knew that this tension couldn't continue. Something had to give. The next few days were tense. Mark had a heated phone conversation with Helen, the muffled sounds of their argument drifting from his home office. When he emerged, his face was drawn and tired. "She says she doesn't know what I'm talking about," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Claims she's been nothing but welcoming to you." I felt a flash of anger, quickly followed by a wave of sadness. "So what now?" I asked, my voice small. Mark pulled me into a hug. "We give her some time to cool off. Then we'll all sit down and talk this out like adults." But time didn't seem to help. If anything, the rift grew wider. Family dinners became an exercise in forced politeness, with Helen barely acknowledging my presence. I found myself dreading every gathering, my stomach in knots as I tried to navigate the minefield of Helen's unpredictable moods. It all came to a head at Emily and Tom's housewarming party. The newlyweds had just moved into a charming little bungalow on the outskirts of town, and everyone had gathered to help them celebrate. I'd spent the morning baking a batch of my famous snickerdoodles, determined to put my best foot forward despite the tension. The party was in full swing when I arrived, the small house bursting with friends and family. Emily greeted me at the door with a warm hug, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the cookie tin. "Oh, you shouldn't have," she exclaimed, but the way she immediately popped one in her mouth told me she was glad I did. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging hellos and compliments on the new house. I was just starting to relax, a glass of white wine in hand, when I spotted Helen across the room. She was deep in conversation with one of Emily's co-workers, but her eyes were fixed on me. Taking a deep breath, I decided to approach her. Maybe if I made the first move, we could start to mend this rift between us. "Helen," I said, plastering on my most genuine smile. "It's good to see you. How have you been?" She turned to me slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, Sarah. I'm fine, thank you. Although I must say, I'm surprised to see you here." I blinked, caught off guard by her tone. "Why wouldn't I be here? Emily's my sister-in-law." Helen let out a small, humorless laugh. "Of course. How could I forget? You do love to be at the center of every family gathering, don't you?" The co-worker she'd been talking to shifted uncomfortably, muttering an excuse before quickly walking away. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I'm just here to support Emily and Tom, like everyone else." "Oh, please," Helen scoffed. "We all know you can't stand not being the center of attention. First the wedding, now this. Tell me, do you plan everything around upstaging my children?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back a step, my wine sloshing dangerously in its glass. "Helen, I don't understand. I've never tried to upstage anyone. I love this family." But Helen was on a roll now, years of pent-up resentment spilling out. Love this family? You've done nothing but try to change it since the day you arrived. Always with your trendy clothes and your fancy job. Did you ever stop to think that maybe you don't fit in here? I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. People were starting to stare, conversations dying down as Helen's voice rose. I searched the crowd desperately for Mark, but he was nowhere to be seen. I'm sorry you feel that way, I managed to choke out. But I've only ever tried to be myself. I can't change who I am. Helen's eyes flashed dangerously. No, I suppose you can't. But you can certainly leave. Go on, Sarah. No one here wants you anyway. The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me, could almost hear the collective intake of breath. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. Just as I was about to turn and flee, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Emily had appeared beside me, her face a mask of fury. That's enough, Mom, she said, her voice ice-cold. Sarah is family, whether you like it or not. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you're the one who should leave. Helen's mouth opened and closed, shock written across her features. She looked around the room, as if seeking support, but found only uncomfortable glances and averted eyes. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, the front door slamming behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet house. As soon as she was gone, the floodgates opened. Emily pulled me into a fierce hug, whispering apologies and reassurances. Mark appeared, having heard the commotion from the backyard, his face a mix of anger and concern. The party dissolved into a flurry of activity, people offering comfort, expressing their shock at Helen's behavior, assuring me that I was loved and wanted. But through it all, I felt numb. The carefully constructed image of our happy family had shattered, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together. As Mark and I drove home that night, the car filled with a heavy silence, I couldn't help but wonder, where do we go from here? How do you rebuild a family when the very foundation has been shaken? And more importantly, did I even want to try? The days following Emily and Tom's housewarming party were a blur of hushed phone calls and tense conversations. Mark spent hours on the phone with his sister, trying to make sense of what had happened. I could hear snippets of their conversations. I had no idea, she's never acted like this before, what are we going to do? Each one a reminder of the rift that had torn through our family. I found myself withdrawing, spending more time at work and less time engaging with the family group chat that used to bring me so much joy. The constant stream of messages felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder of the connection I once had and now feared I'd lost. It was a week after the party when Mark finally broached the subject with me. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the remains of a takeout dinner spread out between us. I'd been pushing a piece of broccoli around my plate, lost in thought, when he cleared his throat. Sarah, he said, his voice gentle but firm. We need to talk about what happened. I looked up, feeling a mixture of dread and relief. Part of me had been waiting for this conversation, while another part wanted to keep pretending everything was fine. Okay, I said, setting down my fork. Let's talk. Mark reached across the table, taking my hand in his. First of all, I want you to know that I'm on your side. What my mom said was completely out of line, and I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Thank you, I managed to whisper. But, Mark continued, and I felt my heart sink at that single word, we need to figure out how to move forward. Mom's been a part of this family for a lot longer than either of us, and I don't think cutting her out completely is the answer. I pulled my hand away, a flash of anger cutting through my sadness. So what are you saying? That I should just forgive and forget? Pretend she didn't humiliate me in front of everyone we know? Mark shook his head quickly. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I just think we need to try to understand where this is coming from. Maybe if we sit down with her, talk things out. Talk things out. I repeated, my voice rising. Mark, she told me I don't belong in this family. That no one wants me here. How am I supposed to just sit down and chat about that over a cup of tea? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. The walls of our cozy kitchen suddenly felt suffocating. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. "Sarah, wait." Mark called after me, but I was already out the door, letting it slam behind me. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, bringing with it a sense of clarity. I started walking, no particular destination in mind, just needing to move. As I wandered through our quiet neighborhood, my mind raced with thoughts and memories. I thought about the first time I met Helen, how nervous I'd been to make a good impression. I remembered her smile as she welcomed me into their home, the way she'd insisted I call her mom after Mark and I got engaged. When had things changed? When had I gone from being a welcome addition to the family to an intruder? My feet carried me to a small park a few blocks from our house. I sat down on a swing, the chains creaking slightly under my weight. As I gently rocked back and forth, I tried to see things from Helen's perspective. Was she feeling replaced? Threatened? Or was there something deeper, some resentment that had been building for years without my knowledge? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, but eventually, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a text from Mark. "I'm sorry. Please come home when you're ready. I love you." Those 3 simple words, "I love you," broke something inside me. The tears I'd been holding back for days finally spilled over, and I found myself sobbing on the swing set like a child. All the hurt, confusion, and anger I'd been bottling up came pouring out in a torrent of emotion. When the tears finally subsided, I felt drained but somehow lighter. I took a deep breath, wiped my face, and started the walk home. As I approached our house, I saw Mark sitting on the front steps, waiting for me. The sight of him, patient, worried, loving, made my heart swell. "I'm sorry," we both said at the same time as I reached him. It broke the tension, and we shared a small laugh. Mark stood up, pulling me into a tight hug. "I shouldn't have pushed," he murmured into my hair. "I know this is hard for you." I leaned into his embrace, feeling some of the tension leave my body. "And I shouldn't have stormed out," I replied. I'm scared, Mark. I don't know how to fix this." We went inside and spent the next few hours talking, really talking, about everything that had happened. We discussed our fears, our frustrations, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt necessary, like lancing a wound to let it heal properly. As the night wore on, we came to a decision. We would meet with Helen, but on our terms. We'd invite her to a neutral location, a quiet cafe we both liked, and lay everything out on the table. No accusations, no defenses, just honest communication. The next morning, I woke up feeling more resolved than I had in weeks. As I sipped my coffee, I drafted a text to Helen, inviting her to meet us. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment before I finally pressed it. There was no going back now. Helen's response came faster than I expected. A simple okay. When and where? No emotion, no apology, but at least she was willing to meet. It was a start. We set the meeting for the following Saturday. The days leading up to it were a mix of anticipation and dread. I found myself rehearsing what I wanted to say, then scrapping it all and starting over. Mark was a steady presence beside me, offering support and reassurance when my nerves threatened to overwhelm me. Saturday dawned bright and clear. As Mark and I walked hand in hand to the cafe, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened today, at least we were facing it together. We arrived first, choosing a quiet table in the corner. I fiddled nervously with my napkin as we waited, jumping slightly when the bell over the door chimed. And there she was, Helen, looking smaller somehow, less intimidating than she had at the party. She approached our table slowly, her face unreadable. "Sarah, Mark," she said by way of greeting, sliding into the seat across from us. An awkward silence fell over the table. I looked at Mark, then at Helen, feeling the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. This was it, the moment of truth, the breaking point that would determine the future of our family. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Helen," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk about what happened at the housewarming party." Helen's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something: regret? Fear? Before her expression hardened again. "Yes," she said, her tone clipped. "I suppose we do. And so it began. The conversation that would either mend the fractures in our family or break us apart for good. As we sat in that quiet cafe, surrounded by the soft murmur of other patrons and the gentle clink of coffee cups, I realized that this was more than just a discussion about one incident. This was about years of unspoken feelings, of assumptions and misunderstandings. It was about finding a way to bridge the gap between the family I'd married into and the person I truly was. As Helen began to speak, her words careful and measured, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: anger, hurt, but also a glimmer of hope. Because no matter how difficult this conversation might be, we were here. We were trying. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start rebuilding what had been broken. The cafe around us faded into the background as Helen began to speak. Her voice, usually so confident and assured, trembled slightly as she looked at us across the table. I owe you both an apology," she started, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "My behavior at the housewarming party was inexcusable. Sarah, I said things that were hurtful and untrue, and I'm deeply sorry for that." I felt Mark's hand squeeze mine under the table as I took a deep breath. "Thank you for saying that, Helen," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I need to understand why. Where did all of that anger come from?" Helen's eyes dropped to the table, and for a moment, I saw a vulnerability in her that I'd never witnessed before. "It's not easy for me to talk about this," she said softly. "But I owe you both an explanation." She took a sip of her water, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "When Mark first introduced you to the family, Sarah, I was thrilled. You were smart, kind, and you made my son happier than I'd ever seen him. But as time went on, I started to feel replaced." I blinked in surprise, not expecting this admission. Helen continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "You fit so seamlessly into our family, always knowing the right thing to say, the perfect gift to give. Everyone adored you. And I found myself wondering, where do I fit in now?" Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Mom, no one was trying to replace you. Sarah's presence in the family doesn't diminish your role." Helen nodded, a sad smile on her face. "I know that, logically. But emotions aren't always logical, are they? I watched as you two built your life together, as you formed this strong bond with Emily, and I felt like I was being pushed to the sidelines. The wedding, seeing you in that beautiful dress, Sarah, being the center of attention, it brought all those insecurities to the surface. I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: sympathy for Helen's feelings, frustration that she had let them fester for so long, and a lingering hurt from her harsh words. "Helen," I said gently, "I never meant to make you feel that way. I've always respected your place in this family. I was just trying to be myself and build relationships with everyone." "I know," Helen replied, meeting my eyes. "And that's what makes my behavior even more shameful. You've done nothing wrong, Sarah. My issues, my insecurities, they're mine to deal with. I let them poison my relationship with you, and in doing so, I've hurt not just you, but our entire family." The weight of her words hung in the air between us. I glanced at Mark, seeing the conflict on his face as he processed his mother's confession. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "We could have talked about this, worked through it together." Helen shook her head, a rueful expression on her face. "Pride, I suppose. And fear. I was afraid that if I admitted to these feelings, it would only push you further away. So I bottled it up, let it fester, until it exploded in the worst possible way." I took a moment to absorb everything Helen had said. Part of me wanted to be angry, to tell her that her insecurities didn't justify her actions. But another part recognized the courage it took to be this vulnerable, to lay bare her deepest fears and regrets. "I appreciate your honesty, Helen," I said finally. "And I understand that these feelings didn't develop overnight. But what you said at the party, it cut deep. You made me feel like an outsider in my own family." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I will regret those words for the rest of my life. I let my own insecurities cloud my judgment and hurt someone I care about deeply. Sarah, you are a vital part of this family. I see how happy you make Mark, how you've enriched all our lives. I was wrong to ever make you feel otherwise. Mark, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Mom, I love you. But what you did was not okay. Sarah is my wife, and when you attack her, you're attacking me too. We're a team. Helen nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I know, and you're right. I've done damage not just to my relationship with Sarah, but with both of you. With the whole family, really. I want to make things right, but I understand if that's not possible immediately. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment. Helen, I won't pretend that hearing your explanation erases the hurt. It's going to take time to rebuild the trust that's been broken. But I'm willing to try if you are. The relief on Helen's face was palpable. Yes, absolutely. I want nothing more than to make amends and rebuild our relationship. Whatever it takes. Mark squeezed my hand again, a silent show of support. I think we all need some time to process this, he said. But I'm glad we had this conversation. It's a start. As we left the cafe, the air between us felt different, not completely cleared, but lighter somehow. The road to healing would be long, but at least now we were all walking in the same direction. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and redefining boundaries. Helen made a conscious effort to change her behavior, sending thoughtful text messages and making an effort to include me in family decisions. I, in turn, tried to be more understanding of her position, to see beyond the hurt she had caused to the insecure woman beneath. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when a casual comment would bring back the sting of that night at the party, or when I'd catch a flicker of the old Helen in a sidelong glance. But we pressed on, each small step forward a victory in its own right. One Sunday afternoon, about a month after our cafe meeting, Helen invited us over for dinner. As we pulled up to her house, I felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach. You okay? Mark asked, cutting the engine. I nodded, taking a deep breath. Yeah, I think so. It's just been a while since we've done this. He leaned over and kissed my cheek. We've got this. Remember, we're a team. As we walked up to the front door, it swung open before we could knock. Helen stood there, a tentative smile on her face. Sarah, Mark, she said warmly. I'm so glad you could come. We stepped inside, and I was immediately enveloped by the comforting aroma of roasting chicken and herbs. The house looked different somehow, brighter, more welcoming. I realized with a start that Helen had redecorated, replacing some of the older, more traditional pieces with items that looked suspiciously like they came from my favorite home decor store. I hope you don't mind, Helen said, noticing my gaze. I thought it was time for a change. Actually, I was hoping to get your opinion on a few things, Sarah. You've always had such a good eye for design. I felt a lump form in my throat, touched by this small but significant gesture. I'd love to help, I managed to say. As we moved to the living room, I noticed a new photo on the mantel, a candid shot from Emily and Tom's wedding. In it, Mark and I were dancing, lost in our own world, while Helen watched from the background, a genuine smile on her face. It was a beautiful moment, one I hadn't even realized had been captured. The evening progressed with a newfound ease. We chatted about work, shared funny stories, and even made tentative plans for a family vacation. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkward silence, times when we all seemed to be trying a bit too hard. But it was progress. As we were leaving, Helen pulled me aside. Sarah, she said softly, I want you to know how much this means to me. Having you here, trying to move forward. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for the chance to earn it. I looked at her, seeing not the intimidating mother-in-law of the past, but a woman who had made mistakes and was genuinely trying to make amends. We're family, Helen, I replied, surprising myself with the sincerity in my voice. It won't always be easy, but we'll figure it out together. As Mark and I drove home that night, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The fallout from Helen's outburst had been painful, but maybe, just maybe, it had cleared the air for something better to grow in its place. You know, Mark said as we pulled into our driveway, I'm really proud of you. Of both of you, actually. It takes a lot of courage to confront these kinds of issues head-on. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. We've still got a long way to go, I said. But I think we're on the right path. As we walked into our home, hand in hand, I realized that family, with all its complexities and challenges, was a journey, not a destination. And while the road might be bumpy at times, it was a journey worth taking, together. As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a new rhythm. The sharp edges of the conflict with Helen began to soften, replaced by a cautious but genuine attempt at rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when a careless word or a misinterpreted glance would bring the old tensions bubbling to the surface. But we were all trying, and that counted for something. One crisp Saturday morning in early fall, I found myself sitting at our kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, leafing through a stack of wedding photos that had just arrived. Emily and Tom had finally gotten around to sending out the formal shots, and as I flipped through them, I was struck by how much had changed since that day. There was a photo of Helen and me, standing side by side, both smiling at the camera. I remembered the moment it was taken, how tense I had felt, trying to maintain the facade of the perfect family. Now, looking at it with fresh eyes, I could see the strain in Helen's smile, the slight distance between us. It was like looking at strangers. Mark wandered into the kitchen, his hair still mussed from sleep. "What have you got there?" he asked, peering over my shoulder. I held up the photo. "Just got the wedding pictures." "It's funny, isn't it? How much can change in such a short time?" He studied the image, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it is. But you know what? I think we're in a better place now. More honest, at least." I nodded, setting the photo aside. He was right. For all the pain and difficulty of the past few months, there was a new openness in our family that hadn't existed before. It was as if the explosion at the housewarming party had cleared away years of unspoken tensions and resentments, leaving us all a bit battered but with a clearer view of each other. "Speaking of honesty," Mark said, settling into the chair across from me, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we had a talk with Emily and Tom. You know, clear the air about everything that happened." I felt a flutter of anxiety in my stomach. Emily had been supportive throughout the whole ordeal, but we'd never really sat down and discussed it in depth. Part of me was afraid of reopening old wounds, but another part knew Mark was right. If we were going to move forward as a family, we needed to be open with each other. "You're right," I said, taking a deep breath. "It's time. Should we invite them over for dinner?" Mark smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "That's my girl. Always facing things head-on." We set the date for the following weekend. As the day approached, I threw myself into preparations, planning the menu, cleaning the house, anything to keep my mind off the conversation to come. The morning of the dinner, I was a bundle of nerves, triple-checking everything and fussing over details that didn't really matter. "Sarah," Mark said gently, catching me as I was about to rearrange the living room furniture for the third time. "It's going to be fine. They're family, remember?" I nodded, letting out a shaky breath. I know. I just want everything to be perfect." He pulled me into a hug, his familiar warmth calming my racing heart. "It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be us." When Emily and Tom arrived, the initial greetings were a bit awkward. We exchanged hugs and small talk, the elephant in the room looming large. But as we settled in the living room with drinks, the tension began to ease. "So," Emily said, setting her glass down on the coffee table, "I guess we should talk about what happened, huh?" I nodded, grateful for her directness. "Yeah, I think we should. I'm sorry we haven't done this sooner." Tom leaned forward, his usually jovial face serious. "Look, we want you both to know that we're on your side. What happened at our housewarming, it wasn't okay." "No, it wasn't," Mark agreed. "But a lot has changed since then. We've had some pretty intense conversations with Mom, and I think we're starting to understand where it all came from." I took over, explaining Helen's feelings of insecurity and fear of being replaced. As I spoke, I could see the surprise on Emily and Tom's faces. "I had no idea she felt that way," Emily said softly when I finished. "I mean, I knew something was off, but I never imagined." "None of us did," I replied. "She hid it well. Too well, maybe." Tom shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "Families, huh? You think you know everything about each other, And then something like this happens. We all chuckled at that, the tension in the room dissipating a bit. As we continued to talk, sharing our perspectives on what had happened and how we'd been dealing with the aftermath, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. There was something incredibly freeing about laying everything out in the open, no more secrets or unspoken resentments. As the evening wore on and we moved to the dining room for dinner, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. We laughed over old family stories, shared updates on our lives, and even started making plans for the upcoming holidays. It felt normal. Like we were finally finding our footing again as a family. After Emily and Tom left, Mark and I stood in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the dishes. "That went well, don't you think?" he asked, bumping my hip with his as he dried a plate. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. "Yeah, it really did. I feel like we can finally start moving forward." The next few weeks brought more small steps towards healing. Helen invited us all over for a Sunday brunch, and to my surprise, it was actually enjoyable. She'd made an effort to include some of my favorite dishes, and there was a new warmth in her interactions with me. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of awkwardness, but it was progress. One evening, as Mark and I were taking a walk around our neighborhood, enjoying the crisp autumn air, he turned to me with a serious expression. "You know, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. How it all came out of these unspoken feelings and assumptions." I nodded, wondering where he was going with this. "Yeah." He stopped walking, turning to face me. "I don't ever want us to fall into that trap. So I want you to know, if you ever feel like I'm not supporting you, or if you're struggling with something in our family, please tell me. Don't let it build up like Mom did." I felt a rush of love for this man who always seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. "I promise," I said, reaching up to cup his face. "And the same goes for you, okay? We're partners in this. No matter what." As we continued our walk, hand in hand, I reflected on the journey we'd been through. The past few months had been some of the most challenging of my life, but they'd also brought a new depth to my relationships, with Mark, with Helen, with the entire family. We'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths, to examine the dynamics that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. And while the process had been painful, I couldn't deny that we'd come out stronger on the other side. There was a new honesty in our interactions, a willingness to address issues head-on rather than letting them fester. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. As we rounded the corner back to our street, I caught sight of our house, the warm glow of the porch light, the full wreath on the door that Helen had helped me make. It struck me then that this messy, complicated, beautiful thing we called family, was worth fighting for. Worth working through the hard times, the misunderstandings, the hurt feelings. Because at the end of the day, family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about trying, about loving each other even when it's difficult. And as I looked at Mark, saw the love and commitment in his eyes, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. As a family. As the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, our family entered a new season, both literally and figuratively. The wounds from the summer's drama were slowly healing, leaving behind scars that served as reminders of how far we'd come. With the holidays approaching, we faced a new challenge, our first Thanksgiving since the blow-up at Emily and Tom's housewarming party. Traditionally, Thanksgiving had always been held at Helen's house. It was her domain, where she'd reign supreme over the kitchen, producing a feast that could feed an army. But this year felt different. The thought of spending an entire day in that house, with all the memories it held, made my stomach churn with anxiety. It was Mark who came up with the solution. "What if we host Thanksgiving this year?" he suggested one evening as we were curled up on the couch, half watching a movie. "Give Mom a break from cooking, start a new tradition." I mulled it over, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. "You think Helen would be okay with that? It's always been her thing." Mark shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Only one way to find out." To our surprise, Helen was receptive to the idea. "That sounds lovely," she said when we called to propose the change. "I could bring my famous pumpkin pie if you'd like. And maybe you could teach me some of your recipes, Sarah? I've always admired your cooking." I felt a warmth spread through me at her words. It was a small thing, But the fact that she was willing to step back from her traditional role and embrace change meant more than I could express. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. I threw myself into menu planning, determined to create a meal that honored tradition while also bringing something new to the table. Mark was my steadfast sous chef, chopping vegetables and taste testing with enthusiasm. The night before Thanksgiving, as we were doing final preparations, I found myself overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. Mark found me in the kitchen, tears streaming down my face as I kneaded dough for dinner rolls. "Hey, hey," he said softly, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "What's wrong?" I leaned back into his embrace, letting out a shaky breath. "Nothing's wrong. That's just it. A few months ago, I thought our family was falling apart. And now we're about to host Thanksgiving. It's just a lot, you know?" Mark pressed a kiss to my temple. "I know. But we've got this. Together." Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and clear. As the parade played on TV in the background, our house filled with the warm, comforting smells of roasting turkey and baking pies. Helen arrived early, pumpkin pie in hand, ready to help with last-minute preparations. There was a moment of awkwardness as she entered the kitchen. This had always been her domain on Thanksgiving, after all. But then I handed her an apron and asked for her opinion on the stuffing, and just like that, we fell into a comfortable rhythm. As we worked side by side, I found myself sharing stories about my own family's Thanksgiving traditions. "My mom always insisted on making cranberry sauce from scratch," I said as I stirred a pot on the stove. "Said the canned stuff was an abomination." Helen laughed, a genuine, warm sound that I realized I hadn't heard in a long time. "My mother was the same way about gravy. Wouldn't touch the stuff from a jar." We swapped stories and cooking tips, and I felt a new bond forming between us. This wasn't the formal, slightly strained relationship we'd had before. This was something real, something built on shared experiences and mutual respect. As our guests began to arrive, Emily and Tom, Mark's cousins, and their families, the house filled with laughter and chatter. Kids ran through the living room, playing an elaborate game of their own invention. The adults gathered in clusters, catching up and sharing news. When it came time to sit down for dinner, I felt a moment of panic. Would the food be okay? Would everyone get along? But as I looked around the table at the faces of our family, I saw only warmth and love. Helen stood up, raising her glass. "Before we begin, I'd like to say something." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to her. This past year has been challenging, to say the least. We've had our ups and downs, our misunderstandings and conflicts. But looking around this table, I'm reminded of what truly matters. Her eyes met mine, filled with unshed tears. Family. Love. Forgiveness. "Sarah, Mark, thank you for opening your home to us, for starting this new tradition. I couldn't be more grateful for each and every one of you." As we dug into the feast, the conversation flowed easily. There were no awkward silences, no tense exchanges. Just family, enjoying each other's company. I caught Mark's eye across the table, and he gave me a wink. We'd done it. We'd not only survived our first major family gathering since the blow-up, but we'd thrived. After dinner, as everyone lounged in various states of food coma, Helen approached me. "Sarah, do you have a moment?" she asked softly. We stepped out onto the back porch, the cool night air a refreshing change from the warm, crowded house. Helen was quiet for a moment, gazing out into the darkened yard. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, turning to face me. "Not just for hosting today, but for everything. Your forgiveness, your willingness to try again with our relationship. I know I didn't make it easy." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Helen," she held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish, please. I've done a lot of thinking over these past few months. About the kind of mother I've been, the kind of mother-in-law. And I realized something. I've been so focused on holding on to my place in this family that I nearly pushed everyone away. But you showed me what it really means to be family. It's not about control or perfection. It's about love, acceptance, and sometimes, it's about letting go." Tears were flowing freely down both our cheeks now. Without thinking, I stepped forward and pulled Helen into a hug. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, her arms coming around me. "We're family," I whispered. "No matter what." As we stood there, embracing on the porch, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was a new beginning, not just for Helen and me, but for our entire family. We'd weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The rest of the evening passed in a warm glow of contentment. As our guests began to leave, each departure was marked by hugs and promises to get together soon. Promises that, for once, felt genuine. After the last guest had gone and we'd tidied up the worst of the mess, Mark and I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but happy. "We did it," I said, snuggling into his side. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "We sure did. You were amazing, you know that." I smiled, thinking back over the day, the laughter, the conversations, the moments of connection. We were amazing. All of us. As we sat there in the quiet of our home, I reflected on the journey we'd been through. The pain, the anger, the fear, it had all led us here, to this moment of peace and understanding. We'd taken the broken pieces of our family and built something new, something stronger. I knew there would be challenges ahead. Families are complex, after all, and old habits die hard. But I also knew that we now had the tools to face those challenges head-on. We'd learned to communicate, to be honest about our feelings, to forgive. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a sense of excitement for the future. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A chance to build the kind of family I'd always dreamed of, one based on love, acceptance, and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. We were family, in every sense of the word. And that was something to be truly thankful for.